The ranch had always been a place of peace. Rolling fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with clusters of oak trees that swayed lazily in the afternoon wind. Horses grazed in the pastures, their tails flicking against the flies, and the old red barn, weathered from years of storms and sunshine, stood like a sentinel at the heart of it all. For Grandpa, who had lived there for more than half a century, the land wasn't just property, it was family. Life on the ranch followed a rhythm as steady as the sun. Morning chores started before dawn, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and getting the day's work planned. Afternoons were quieter, often spent mending equipment or sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the horizon. Evenings brought laughter around the dinner table, stories swapped across generations, and the comforting silence of stars overhead. But all of that changed the day the black pickup appeared. It was a Tuesday, warm and breezy. The youngest of the grandkids had been chasing chickens across the yard while Grandma worked on a pie cooling by the window. A low rumble cut through the peaceful afternoon, a truck engine, unfamiliar and out of place on their quiet dirt road. Everyone turned to look as dust billowed in the distance. The truck came into view, sleek and polished, a modern machine that seemed almost too clean for the dusty ranch. It rolled confidently up the gravel drive and stopped directly in front of the barn doors, blocking the way as if it owned the spot. The driver's door swung open with a squeak. Out stepped a man in his 40s, wearing a black vest with a shiny badge clipped to it. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but the way he moved carried an air of authority, the kind that made people hesitate before asking questions. "Afternoon," he said in a voice that was more command than greeting. "I'm here for a routine inspection. HOA rules." Silence fell. The family exchanged puzzled looks. HOA. There wasn't a homeowners association anywhere near the ranch. The closest neighborhood was 5 miles down the highway, and even that was a small cluster of houses that barely counted as a subdivision. Out here, the land was free, unruled by any association. Grandpa, sitting on the porch with his tea, raised his eyes to the man but said nothing. It was his way, he let others speak first. Finally, Grandma stepped forward. "Sir," she said carefully, wiping her hands on her apron, "I think you may be mistaken. This land isn't part of any HOA. We're outside city limits." The man gave a short laugh, the kind that wasn't amused at all. "Regulations are regulations. Everyone's under HOA jurisdiction, one way or another." Without waiting for a reply, he walked back to his truck, climbed inside, and reclined his seat. The vehicle remained right there, in front of the barn doors. The family stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to react. Finally, one of the older kids spoke. "Grandpa, who is he?" Grandpa didn't answer right away. He took another sip of tea, his eyes never leaving the truck. Then, softly, he said, "He's not who he says he is." The rest of the day passed in unease. Work slowed, chores delayed, animals rerouted because the barn doors were blocked. By evening, the stranger finally drove away, leaving behind nothing but dusty tire tracks and a bitter taste in the air. But he came back. At first it was every few days. Then, it became routine, almost as if he had marked the ranch as his territory. Each time, the same pattern. He'd pull up, park in front of the barn, and sit there, sometimes for hours. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always the same vague explanation, just following HOA rules. The family tried to ignore it. They told themselves he'd get bored eventually, that he'd realize he had no business there. But as the weeks dragged on, the visits continued, and the tension grew. The ranch, once a place of comfort, now felt watched. The kids played less outside. The adults muttered frustrations under their breath. And through it all, Grandpa sat quietly on the porch, watching, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, something was stirring. The black pickup returned the very next week, and by then, nobody in the family could pretend it was just some misunderstanding. Grandpa had been sitting on the porch again, his hat tilted low to shade his eyes from the afternoon sun. When the rumble of the engine reached his ears, he didn't even flinch. He just set his teacup down on the railing and waited. Sure enough, the familiar gleam of polished metal came crawling up the driveway, raising a plume of dust behind it. The truck stopped in the same place as before, right in front of the barn doors. The man stepped out, once again wearing that vest and that cheap-looking badge. Sunglasses hid his expression, but the way he leaned against the truck, arms crossed, made it clear he wasn't here to be friendly. HOA inspection, he announced, as if it were the start of a ritual. This time, Grandpa finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm, like the steady hum of a river that hides how strong its current is. "There's no HOA out here." The man tilted his head, smiling faintly, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Every property's under rules. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Grandpa didn't reply. He just studied the man, eyes narrowing slightly, then turned and walked back to his rocking chair. The exchange was over, as far as he was concerned, but the rest of the family wasn't so patient. At dinner that evening, the tension spilled over. The kitchen filled with the smells of roasted chicken and fresh bread, but the mood at the table was heavy. "This is getting ridiculous," muttered Daniel, Grandpa's oldest son. He stabbed at his food harder than necessary. "He's blocking the barn again. I had to unload feed sacks at the road and haul them by hand. I had to walk the horses around through the back fence," added Sarah, one of the grandkids. "They spooked at the sound of his engine and nearly bolted." Grandma sighed. "I tried telling him again today. He just repeated the same line. HOA this, HOA that. Didn't even look me in the eye." "Why doesn't anyone call the sheriff?" asked little Henry, the youngest, his voice timid but curious. The adults exchanged looks. Finally, Daniel answered, "Because technically, he isn't breaking any law just by parking on private property unless we press trespassing charges." "And the sheriff?" He hesitated, shaking his head. "The sheriff's stretched thin as it is. He'd probably just tell us to work it out." Grandpa, who had been quietly buttering his bread, finally spoke. "He'll slip up. People like him always do." The table went silent. Grandpa's voice wasn't angry, but there was weight in it. It wasn't a prediction, it was certainty. But the rest of the family wasn't so patient. At dinner that evening, the tension spilled over. The kitchen filled with the smells of roasted chicken and fresh bread, but the mood at the table was heavy. "This is getting ridiculous," muttered Daniel, Grandpa's oldest son. He stabbed at his food harder than necessary. "He's blocking the barn again. I had to unload feed sacks at the road and haul them by hand. I had to walk the horses around through the back fence," added Sarah, one of the grandkids. "They spooked at the sound of his engine and nearly bolted." Grandma sighed. "I tried telling him again today. He just repeated the same line. HOA this, HOA that. Didn't even look me in the eye." "Why doesn't anyone call the sheriff?" asked little Henry, the youngest, his voice timid but curious. The adults exchanged looks. Finally, Daniel answered, "Because technically he isn't breaking any law just by parking on private property unless we press trespassing charges." "And the sheriff?" He hesitated, shaking his head. "The sheriff's stretched thin as it is. He'd probably just tell us to work it out." Grandpa, who had been quietly buttering his bread, finally spoke. "He'll slip up. People like him always do." The table went silent. Grandpa's voice wasn't angry, but there was weight in it. It wasn't a prediction, it was certainty. Paragraph 3, Image 3, the storm in Grandpa's resolve as the days went by. Grandpa kept watching. He noticed things the others didn't. The way the man avoided giving his name. The way his truck was spotless. Not a scratch, not a dent like any real inspector's vehicle, which would be battered from long days on the job. And most telling of all, the badge. Grandpa had seen real ones before. This one was nothing more than shiny metal with the word security etched into it. The kids whispered among themselves about it. They called him the fake cop, though, never within his earshot. They made a game of peeking at him from behind the curtains whenever he showed up. But to the adults, it wasn't a game, it was harassment. Each visit seemed longer than the last. He'd park, lean back in his seat, and stay there for hours, as if daring someone to confront him. Sometimes, he pretended to write notes in a little pad. Other times, he simply sat, sunglasses reflecting the ranch like twin mirrors, his face unreadable. Grandpa's patience, though vast, wasn't endless. Late one evening, after the stranger finally drove off, Daniel found Grandpa still sitting on the porch, staring at the fading tire tracks in the dirt. The air smelled faintly of rain, heavy with the promise of a storm. "You're thinking of something," Daniel said quietly. Grandpa didn't answer right away. He lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and then set it down again. Finally, he said, "Men like him don't respect words, they respect lines. You draw one, and they'll either cross it or leave." Daniel frowned. "And if he crosses it," Grandpa leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the horizon, "then we'll handle it the way this land has always handled. Problems direct, simple, and final." The younger man didn't press further. He'd grown up on this ranch, and he knew that tone in Grandpa's voice. It was the same tone Grandpa used when dealing with sick livestock, busted fences, or broken machines. Tom practical. Absolute. The storm rolled in later that night. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rattled the walls. But inside, the family felt a different storm brewing, one that had nothing to do with weather, because the stranger wasn't going away, and Grandpa wasn't going to let it slide forever. By the third week, the truck had become a fixture. It would appear like clockwork every few days. The same polished black paint gleaming under the sun, the same heavy tires grinding into the gravel, and always in front of the barn. At first, the family thought he was simply trying to get under their skin. But as his visits stretched longer, sometimes nearly the whole day, it became impossible to ignore. Work was piling up, chores delayed, tempers frayed. Something had to give. It was Grandma who finally said, "Maybe we should try kindness." The family looked at her in disbelief. They had already asked politely, explained, pleaded even. Nothing worked. But Grandma wasn't talking about words. She meant the universal olive branch of hospitality. "I've lived long enough to know," she said firmly, hands planted on her apron. "Some men soften when they see they're treated like neighbors. If he's lonely, if he's searching for attention, maybe that's why he keeps coming back. Maybe he just needs a little warmth." No one argued with Grandma when she spoke like that. So the next day, when the rumble of the truck echoed across the fields again, Grandma already had a plan. She set a pie on the counter, a golden, steaming apple pie fresh from the oven, and called Sarah to help carry it. Together, they walked across the yard, the smell of cinnamon trailing behind them. The man was leaning against his truck as usual, arms crossed, sunglasses fixed in place. When Grandma approached with the pie, he cocked his head in surprise. "Afternoon," she greeted him with a smile. "Thought you might like a slice of pie, fresh baked." He glanced at the pie, then at her. Slowly, he took it, muttering, "Thanks." But there was no gratitude in his tone, just a casual acceptance, as though he felt entitled to it. Grandma pressed on, ever hopeful. "We just want to clear up any misunderstanding. This ranch isn't part of an HOA. Happy to show you property lines, deeds, whatever paperwork you'd like to see." The man smirked, fork already cutting into the crust. "Regulations are regulations, doesn't matter what paperwork you've got. HOA oversees all land use." He took a bite, chewing loudly. "Good pie, though." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with frustration. "Sir, you don't understand." But Grandma gently touched her arm, stopping her. She gave the man one last polite nod, then turned and walked back toward the house. Sarah followed, seething. "Why'd you let him get away with that?" Sarah demanded, once they were out of earshot. "Because sometimes," Grandma replied softly, "you need to let a man show his true self." He just did. The rest of the family wasn't so patient. Daniel had been watching from the porch, fists clenched. "He eats our pie, smirks in our faces, and keeps blocking the barn. Enough is enough. Next time he shows up, I'll call the sheriff." But Grandpa shook his head. "No, not yet." Daniel turned on him. "Then what are we waiting for? He's mocking us. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. Why not let the law handle it?" Grandpa's gaze stayed fixed on the truck, which gleamed smugly in the sunlight. "Because the law will write reports and file papers. Men like him, they don't fear paper. They only understand consequences." The family fell silent at that, because there was something in Grandpa's tone they all recognized. It was the sound of a storm gathering, quiet but unstoppable. Over the next few days, the tension only worsened. The stranger seemed emboldened by their failed attempt at kindness. He left his truck longer than ever, sometimes all night. The headlights cast eerie glows across the barn walls, keeping the animals restless. At one point, he even spread a lawn chair beside his truck, sipping a soda as though he were hosting a private picnic on their land. The family's frustration boiled over. Even the younger kids began whispering bitterly about the fake cop. One evening after the man finally left, Sarah sat on the porch beside Grandpa. The crickets chirped in the distance, and the stars glittered overhead. "Why do you let him stay, Grandpa?" she asked softly. "Why don't you just tell him to leave for good?" Grandpa didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "Finally," he said, "because I'm giving him rope." Sarah frowned. "Rope?" Grandpa nodded. "A man who's bluffing always hangs himself if you give him enough rope. And when that happens," he let the words hang in the night air, "that's when the ranch has its say." Sarah didn't fully understand, but she felt a shiver crawl down her spine at his words. The stranger might have thought he was winning, but in truth, he was walking straight into Grandpa's trap, one that didn't need anger or shouting to spring shut. Just patience. And Grandpa had patience in spades. The ranch woke to a strange quiet the morning it finally happened, the kind of quiet that presses against the windows and sits in the kitchen like a guest who arrived before anyone was ready. A soft haze hung over the fields, and the dew on the grass sparkled in the first light. Somewhere out near the east pasture, a meadow lark whistled and then fell silent, as if even the birds were waiting to see what the day would bring. Grandpa rose before anyone else. He always did. He moved through his morning chores with the same patient rhythm he'd kept for decades: feed the horses, check the troughs, look over the fences. His hands were quick and practiced. He didn't hurry, but he didn't linger either. The work was a conversation between him and the land, and he didn't like to be interrupted once it started. When he came back up the path toward the house, he saw tire tracks cutting into the gravel that hadn't been there an hour ago. The tracks were fresh. The tread marks still held tiny beads of dew. They came from the road and ran in a straight line toward the barn, as certain as a signature. He didn't need to follow them to know where they ended. The black pickup sat planted in front of the barn doors, blocking the entrance cleanly, as if it had been positioned by a measuring tape. The man had tilted his seat back and pulled his cap down over his face, like he was shading himself from the early light. There was an empty coffee cup on the dashboard and a clipboard on the passenger seat. On the vest, the same metal badge caught the pale sun and flickered. Grandpa stood halfway down the path for a long moment, hands in his pockets. He looked at the truck, then at the barn door beyond it. Painted red and edged with iron hinges, he'd replaced himself just last winter. He looked at the shape of the day he had planned. Hay bales to move, a wheel to mend, 2 horses to brush and saddle for an afternoon. Redanned how this one truck had been laid across it, like a fallen tree across a road. He didn't call for anyone. He simply turned and walked up the porch steps. Inside the house was waking up. The kettle was beginning to murmur on the stove. The smell of oats and cinnamon drifted out of the kitchen. The floorboards, when stepped on just so, made the same old music they had made for 50 years. Grandma met him in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. He's back already. Grandpa nodded once. She studied his face the way only someone who'd shared a life with him could. She saw that there was no anger there, a kind of stillness that meant the thinking was done and the doing would begin. Eat before you do anything, she said gently. Even a plan needs a steady hand. By the time the others came down, Daniel with his sleeves rolled, Sarah tying her hair back with a scrap of twine, little Henry blinking sleep from his eyes. The house had settled on a kind of quiet resolve. No one was surprised when Grandpa told them to keep to their chores for now. No one argued. They ate, they cleared plates, they put on boots. All the while, beyond the kitchen window, the truck sat like a punctuation mark that insisted on being read. By mid-morning, the sun had burned off the haze and turned the fields bright and sharp. The air was clean, the kind of morning that makes a person want to work just to be part of it. But the barn doors were blocked, and the morning's rhythm had been broken, and that had a way of fraying every nerve it touched. Daniel hefted a sack of feed onto his shoulder and paused at the sight of the truck. He can't keep doing this, he said, more to the open air than to anyone in particular. He can, Grandpa replied evenly, until he can't. Sarah came up beside them with a coil of rope. He's sleeping, she whispered, peeking over the hood. Or pretending. He's not sleeping, Grandpa said. He's listening. The man proved Grandpa right soon enough. He pushed his cap back and opened his door with a leisurely stretch, then climbed out onto the gravel and took his time looking at the ranch as if he owned a little piece of it. The sunglasses were on. The badge was shining. The voice was the same flat authority he liked to wrap around words that didn't deserve it. HOA inspection, he said, like a greeting. Grandpa nodded once, not moving from where he stood. You've said that. Got to make sure the property's in compliance. The man went on. I'll be here off and on. Best you get used to it. And what compliance is that? Daniel asked, setting the feed down with a controlled thump. Because there's no HOA here. The man's smile didn't reach his cheeks. Property use, vehicle access, public safety, lot of ways a place like this can fall out of order. Sarah felt blood rush to her face. This is private land. Your grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That's enough. The three of them fell quiet. Grandpa stepped forward until he and the man stood a few yards apart. Two figures at the edge of a day that had been waiting to happen. You've had your say, Grandpa said. Now you'll have mine. That truck is blocking a barn door. You don't belong here. You're not what you say you are. This is the last time you'll park there. The man tipped his chin as if he were being humored by a child. You can file a complaint, he said. There's a process. Grandpa's eyes didn't waver. There's a process here, too. The man laughed once, short and pleased with itself, and climbed back into his truck. He shut the door with a firm pull and set his seat back again. A picture of someone perfectly confident in his position. The engine ticked softly in the heat. The badge shone. The minutes stretched. Work tried to go on around the obstacle. Daniel and Sarah hauled feed the long way, around the back path, through the gate that groaned when it turned. Little Henry held the gate open and tried not to look at the truck. Grandma wiped the counters and reset the kettle, then stood for a long time at the sink, not moving, the towel in her hands gone still. Grandpa went to the shed. The shed kept a lot of things, memories and tools. The smell of old oil and sun-warmed wood, the weight of days spent fixing the world with whatever was at hand. On a peg near the back hung the chain. It was heavy and honest, links thick and cold, with iron that had dulled from years of use. Grandpa lifted it from the peg and it settled across his forearms like something alive. He set the chain in a coil by the door and looked around for the other piece he needed. The hitch sat on a shelf, the same one he'd welded a dozen summers ago when the trailer kept coughing loose from the tractor over rough ground. He ran a thumb along the weld line. It was solid, straight, the kind of job you didn't have to look back on. When he stepped out of the shed, the light caught the chain and turned each link into a small sun. The sound it made as he walked the soft, sure clink carried across the yard. The family looked up. No one said a word. He laid the chain near the tractor and stood a moment with a hand on the hood. That tractor had worked every season with him. It had dragged logs out of gullies, pulled fence posts straight, and brought a neighbor's stuck truck free the winter the creek flooded. He checked the oil, the fuel, the tires. He didn't need to, but old habits were a kind of prayer. Daniel approached, careful and quiet. You sure? Grandpa nodded. Want me to? No, Grandpa said, gentle as a closed door. Keep to your chores. Everyone keeps to their chores. I'll keep to mine. There was no drama in it. That was part of what made the air feel so thick. This wasn't a performance or a burst of temper. It was a day's work, adjusting itself to include one more necessary task. The tractor coughed once, then found its breath. Grandpa let it idle and walked the chain over to the pickup. The man watched him through the window, a faint smile on his face, the kind reserved for people you're sure are bluffing. You touch my vehicle, he said through the glass, and you'll be answering to a lot more than me. Grandpa didn't answer. He lowered himself to one knee by the rear axle. The gravel pressed his jeans. The earth smelled clean. He took the chain in his hands and fed it under the axle, drew it up, set the links so they bit into themselves. The sound of iron on iron was calm and clear. Inside the truck, the man sat up straight. The smile was gone. He opened his door so quickly it bounced. "That's enough," he snapped, stepping out. "You can't do that. It's already done," Grandpa said without looking up. "You're crazy," the man said. "You think you can, you know what? Fine. You want to play tough. I'll call it in." "You do that," Grandpa replied, standing and brushing dust from his hands. "And while you're on the line, you can explain why your badge says one thing and your story says another." The man glanced down involuntarily. It was the smallest movement, but it gave away more than any speech could. He set his jaw and put his sunglasses back on, like a curtain that protects a stage when the scenery isn't ready. "Last chance," he said. "Already passed," Grandpa answered. He walked back to the tractor and caught the chain to the hitch with one steady motion. Around them, the ranch seemed to lean in. Even the wind held itself back. The man climbed into his truck as if the simple act would protect him by habit. The door slammed shut. The engine didn't start. Perhaps he didn't think it needed to. Perhaps he thought a parked truck was an anchor that no storm could lift. He was wrong about many things that day. Grandpa eased the tractor forward just enough to take the slack out of the chain. The links stretched, found their line, and then sang a low note of readiness. He gave the tractor a whisper of throttle, nothing more. The pickup rocked, surprised. The man reached for the wheel with both hands, bracing himself without thinking. Grandpa set the tractor into motion. It didn't feel like force. It felt like gravity being reminded where to go. The chain held, the axle groaned, the truck rolled. Gravel hissed under tires that weren't turning by their own will. The man shouted something that turned into nothing when it left his mouth. The barn door, once blocked, began to open by the simple act of the obstacle moving away from it. They went slow. Grandpa didn't hurry. He brought the truck down the path it had come in on. Past the edge of the garden where the soil was black and soft, past the oak where a swing hung idle, past the fence line that ran like a sentence underlining the property's name. The tractor hummed, the chain spoke, the morning brightened. From the porch, Grandma stood with her hands folded at her waist. Daniel watched with shoulders square. Sarah held little Henry close, and he watched with wide eyes that weren't frightened so much as full of the understanding that something fair was happening, and that fairness sometimes looked strong. The creek lay ahead, its banks low from a mild spring, its surface dappled with light through the leaves. It wasn't deep, it wasn't dangerous, but it was enough to take the shine off anything that didn't belong there. Grandpa did not look back to see what the man was doing inside the truck. He didn't need to. He kept the tractor straight and true. When the front tires of the pickup met the grassy dip of the bank, they hesitated like a question. The tractor answered, the chain drew a line through the moment, and the truck slid the rest of the way with a soft, heavy surrender. The wheels sank into the muddy bed, the undercarriage took the creek's weight, and the whole machine settled like a boast that had run out of breath. Grandpa eased the tractor to a stop and let the engine idle. He dismounted and walked the chain back through the shallow water. The man pushed his door open and stood in the creek up to his shins, surprise and indignation fighting on his face. "You can't just," he started. "You already did," Grandpa said, unhooking the chain with the same careful hands he used to fix a bridle. "Next time you don't park at my barn." "That's my property," the man said, voice cracking around the edges. "You had no right." Grandpa lifted the chain clear and let the last link drop into his palm. "You had no right to put it where it didn't belong. I'm returning it to a place it can do less harm." The man looked from the truck to the bank, measuring distances that were no longer in his favor. "I'll be back," he said, but he didn't sound sure. "You'll be wiser if you're not," Grandpa replied, and there was no threat in it, only a straightforward truth, like saying the sun would set or that a field needs rain. He carried the chain back to the tractor and seated it across the fender. Water dripped from the links and darkened the dust below in honest circles. He climbed into the seat and turned the tractor toward the yard. His hands were steady on the wheel, his shoulders easy. The work ahead of him, hay mending, brushing down the horses, looked right again, as if the day had finally found its feet. At the barn, the door stood unhindered. A red promise kept. Daniel met him there, a question in his face that was mostly pride. "You could have asked for help," Daniel said quietly. "I did," Grandpa answered, eyes crinkling. "I asked the tractor?" Grandma shook her head, but the smile she wore started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. "Coffee's ready," she said, "and I suppose I'll need to wash the good towels if anyone's planning to step in the creek today." Sarah laughed, the sound gentle and relieved. Little Henry tugged at Grandpa's sleeve. "Is it over?" "For us," Grandpa said. "For him, it's just beginning. He has to decide what he'll be next." They went back to work. The ranch absorbed the morning like a field absorbs rain after a dry spell, quietly, gratefully, each furrow taking what it needed. The rhythm returned, hooves on earth, the scrape of a rake, the murmur of voices that didn't need to shout to be heard. Down at the creek, the pickup glinted in the sunlight, no longer a badge of intrusion but a caution set in water and mud. The man stood on the bank, looking smaller than he had looked in the driveway. He took off his sunglasses and wiped them on his vest, then put them back on as if armor could return once removed. After a while, he started the long walk up the road, leaving tire ruts and footprints and a lesson behind him. By noon, the barn doors were rolling on their hinges with the smooth sigh of a well-made thing doing what it was meant to do. Daniel brought the wagon around, Sarah led the horses through, and Henry carried the smallest tools with the solemn pride of a helper entrusted. Grandma's voice drifted from the kitchen window, calling them in for sandwiches. Everything that had been halted began to move again. Grandpa paused at the threshold of the barn and looked out over the yard. The light had shifted, the shadows turning shorter and sharper. He could feel the ranch breathe in and breathe out, as if it, too, had been waiting to see what would happen, and could now return to the business of living. He wasn't thinking of victory. He wasn't thinking of making a point. He was thinking of lines, and how they must be drawn, not with anger, but with clarity, straight, true, and once. He was thinking of how a home is not just a place but a promise to those within it that they will be safe, and how sometimes keeping that promise means moving what does not belong. He picked a bit of dried mud from the edge of his boot and let it fall. Then he stepped into the barn and went back to work. Behind him, the path to the creek caught the sunlight like a silver thread. It would fade soon enough. Tracks always did, but the line he'd drawn would hold, the kind that is invisible and understood all the same. That afternoon, a breeze moved through the oak leaves, and the swing creaked softly where it hung. The horses settled, the tools found their places, and the ranch, having seen the day it knew was coming, set itself gently back into the shape it had always wanted to keep. When evening came, the sky went the color of old copper, and the first star found its way into view. The family gathered on the porch with glasses of tea that caught the last of the light. No one spoke of the truck or the creek. There was nothing left to say. They talked instead about the weather, and whether the north pasture would need reseeding, and whether the new foal would favor the mare or the sire. But in the spaces between words, something warm moved, gratitude, relief, a respect that deepened when tested. The day had settled one thing once and for all. Their home was theirs, not because they had said it many times, but because, when the time came, they had lived it. Grandpa set his glass down and looked out at the barn. The door stood darkened, open against the evening, a square of quiet where work slept. He listened to the sounds he knew as well as his own breath. Crickets beginning their song, a screen door tapping once in the breeze, the last clink of ice. Tomorrow, he said, almost to himself, we'll move the hay. The creek had claimed the truck, but in the days that followed, the ranch still felt the weight of what had happened. The man hadn't come back yet, though nobody truly believed it was over. Men like that didn't slink away quietly. They brooded, plotted, nursed their pride. And Grandpa knew it. So on the third morning after, when the mist lay thick across the fields and the dew clung heavy on the grass, he rose earlier than usual, even earlier than the sun. The house was silent, the air cool, and the familiar creak of the porch boards followed him as he stepped out with his lantern in hand. He walked to the shed. The shed was more than wood and nails. It was a vault of memory. Everything inside had a story. The plow blade in the corner, dulled but not forgotten, had broken ground the year the north pasture was first seeded. The shelves sagged under jars of bolts, screws, nails, each one kept because someday you'll need it. Old saddles hung on pegs like ghosts of horses, long buried, and there, on its hook, hung the chain. Grandpa lifted it carefully. Its weight was familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend. Each link bore the scars of work done honestly, a scrape from hauling, a fallen log, a dent from pulling a neighbor's tractor free from mud, rust from the seasons it had weathered hanging there in the dim light. This chain wasn't just metal. It was a tool shaped by years of service, as much a part of the ranch as the soil itself. He laid it out on the workbench, running his hands over each link as though inspecting soldiers before a march. He didn't need to. He already knew it would hold. It always had. Grandpa wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either. His face was calm, deliberate, the kind of expression that told anyone watching. He wasn't weighing whether to act. He was weighing how, behind him, the faint creak of the door announced another presence. It was Sarah, her hair still in tangles from sleep, clutching a shawl against the chill. "You're up early," she said softly. Grandpa nodded, eyes still on the chain. "Morning doesn't wait." "Neither do I." She hesitated, then asked, "You think he'll come back?" Grandpa finally looked at her. Men who bluff always come back. They want to prove they weren't bluffing. That's how they hang themselves. Sarah hugged her shawl tighter, unsure whether to be frightened or reassured. Grandpa's words didn't sound like threats. They sounded like weather reports, unavoidable, factual, carried in the wind. Later that morning, Daniel came out to check the tractor. He found Grandpa already there, sleeves rolled, hands working over the old machine with the kind of care one might give to a horse before a long ride. The tractor was no stranger to hard work. Its red paint was faded, its seat worn smooth, its tires patched and repatched, but the engine still roared with life when called upon. Grandpa had bought it second-hand in his 30s, and it had pulled through droughts, storms, and winters that cracked the ground like glass. Daniel leaned on the doorway, watching hold. Grandpa glanced up briefly. "She's never failed me yet." Daniel nodded slowly. "Neither have you." Grandpa didn't reply. Compliments rolled off him like rain off tin. Instead, he tightened a bolt and gave the wheel a testing tug. Satisfied, he reached for the hitch. Sarah appeared again, this time with Henry trailing close behind her. The boy's eyes were wide, bouncing between the tractor and the chain coiled like a snake in the dirt. "Grandpa," Henry asked timidly, "are you gonna fight him?" Grandpa knelt to meet the boy's eyes. His voice was steady, but not unkind. "This isn't a fight, Henry. This is just setting things back where they belong." Henry nodded, though he didn't quite understand. Sarah rested a hand on the boy's shoulder and steered him back toward the porch. By midday, the family had gone about their chores again, though the air felt taut, as though strung by invisible wire. Everyone sensed the same thing. The man would return. The question wasn't if, but when. And so, while the ranch hummed with its usual rhythm, horses fed, fields checked, tools cleaned, there was another rhythm beating underneath, low and steady. Grandpa's rhythm. He moved with calm precision, oiling the chain, setting the hitch, fueling the tractor. Each task was small on its own. Together, they became something larger. By evening, the chain gleamed in the fading light. The tractor stood ready, and Grandpa sat once more on the porch with his tea. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in red and gold. The family gathered too, not talking much, each carrying their thoughts in silence. It was Sarah who finally spoke. "You think tomorrow?" Grandpa's eyes didn't leave the horizon. "Tomorrow or the next. Doesn't matter. The creek isn't going anywhere." The family absorbed his words like scripture. They didn't press further. That night the house slept uneasily, each member waking once or twice to listen for the rumble of a truck engine, but none came, not yet. At dawn, Grandpa was up again. And this time, when he walked to the shed, he didn't take the lantern. He didn't need it. The chain was already waiting. The stage was set. The morning arrived the way certain moments always do, quiet on the surface, decided underneath. A pearly light spread across the fields, turning the dew into a million small mirrors. The air was clean, the kind that fills your chest and steadies your hands. The ranch breathed in and breathed out, and somewhere within that breath, a low rumble rolled out on the road like a line being underlined for the last time. The black pickup appeared through the cottonwood gap, same as ever, as if it had never left at all. It moved slowly, confidently, letting the gravel speak for it. The truck slid into its old position in front of the barn doors, as though a magnet lived there. The man inside shut off the engine and sat a while, hands on the wheel, the badge on his vest catching the early light. When he finally stepped out, his sunglasses were already on. He rested an arm on the open door and looked across the yard. With a familiar, practiced calm, he had come back. Not to talk, not to compromise. To reclaim ground that had never been his. Grandpa was already on the porch. He looked like he always did in the morning. Hat set just so. Shirt sleeves rolled. Once, not a rush in him, he finished his tea before he stood. He set the cup down without a sound. The motion said what words didn't need to. It was today. Daniel saw it too. He set aside the hay hook he'd been holding and came to stand a few steps behind Grandpa. Sarah joined him, wiping her palms on her jeans. Little Henry waited in the doorway, holding the frame with both hands as if the house might float away without him. The man broke the quiet first. "HOA inspection," he said, the syllables neat and well-worn. Grandpa's face didn't change. "You're on private land. Everything's under jurisdiction," the man replied. "There are standards to be met." "You've had your say," Grandpa answered. "This is mine. The barn stays open. The road stays clear. You don't belong here. You won't block this door again." The man's mouth quirked a fraction at one corner. "You going to call someone? Fill out a form?" "I'm not moving this truck." "No forms," Grandpa said. "No calling." He stepped down from the porch. The boards gave a single familiar creak. He didn't hurry. He crossed the yard at the same pace he would use to check a gate, to greet a neighbor, to fetch a tool. His steadiness did not come from force. It came from certainty. He walked past the truck without looking inside and went straight to the shed. Inside, the chain waited where he had left it, oiled coils even, links clean in the morning light. He lifted it in both hands, felt its weight, and rested it across his forearms like a promise. The hitch lay beside the tractor where he'd set it the night before. The tractor itself looked patient and ready. He checked it anyway. Fuel, oil, tires. The old ritual that had kept older machines alive for longer than anybody expected. By the time he rolled the tractor into the yard, the sun had risen enough to throw shadows with edges. The tractor's engine came to life with a steady, grounded sound. The family drew together near the porch without a word. Grandma stood at the steps with a towel in her hands she'd forgotten to fold. Even the horses in the paddock turned their heads toward the hum. Grandpa carried the chain to the rear of the black pickup. The man watched him approach. He didn't move at first, only tipped his head as if to say, "There you go again." When Grandpa knelt and began feeding the chain under the axle, the man's stillness sharpened into something tighter. "Don't touch my vehicle," he said. His tone jumped half a key higher. "You can't do that." Grandpa's hands did not hurry. He looped the chain, gave it slack, set the angle, waited until the weight found itself and the links lay true. He stood, dusted his palms, and looked at the man through a space that suddenly felt measured and exact. "You've been told," Grandpa said. "Now you'll be moved." The man opened the driver's door with more force than needed. The door bounced and he caught it, fingers whitening around the edge. He slid into the seat, slammed the door, and gripped the wheel. He wasn't smiling now. He set his jaw like someone bracing against wind. Grandpa walked back to the tractor and hooked the chain to the hitch with a practiced motion. The links answered with a small iron sound. He climbed into the seat, eased the tractor into a low gear, and took up the slack slowly until the chain ran straight and sang its quiet, even note. The first tug is where most plans fail. People pull too hard or not enough. They let temper drive the throttle or fear hold it back. Grandpa did neither. He gave the tractor a breath more fuel. The tires pressed into the earth, the chain tightened, and the truck reacted the way heavy things do when they're reminded that motion exists. It resisted for a heartbeat, then gave way. The pickup shifted. Gravel hissed beneath tires that weren't turning by choice. The truck sketched a short arc as it lined up with the tractor's path and then fell into it. The man's frame, visible through the glass, stiffened. His hands clamped at 10 and 2. His head dipped forward as if he'd been bumped from behind by a thought he didn't want. Grandpa kept the tractor steady. There was nothing flashy about it. No jerks, no grandstand. Just work. The procession moved past the porch. Daniel and Sarah stood to one side, every muscle held still. Grandma's eyes tracked the chain, then the axle, then the small increments of progress that aggregated into something larger. Henry stared unblinking, absorbed by how something so simple or chain a tractor. A man who meant what he said could change everything. They passed the oak where the swing hung motionless. The shadow of the tree drew stripes across the hood of the pickup like a ledger tallying columns no one else could see. They passed the garden fence where beans curled around twine and the soil was dark with good work. They passed the spot where the path narrowed and the ground tilted ever so slightly toward the creek, as if nature itself had been counseling this outcome all along. Inside the truck, the man found his voice again, but it didn't carry the same weight it had in the driveway. He said a sentence that tried to be a warning and sounded more like a question. The windows caught and broke the words. The ranch didn't answer. It didn't need to. At the fence line, a meadowlark fluttered from a post and sailed low toward the field. Its flight drew the eye to the creek ahead, a ribbon of light moving between banks of damp earth and trimmed grass. The water wasn't deep today, it murmured. Over stones, busy, unconcerned, the far bank held a scatter of white pebbles that had wandered downstream from some storm years ago. Grandpa guided the tractor toward the shallow run where the bottom was firm. He had forded here in bad weather and knew exactly where the ground kept its grip. He glanced once at the chain to judge the angle. He did not look back again. His hands on the wheel were quiet and absolute. At the lip of the bank, the truck hesitated, weighted forward by momentum, rear lifted by the line of pull. A different driver might have stabbed the gas then, a reflex born of habit and noise. The man didn't. Maybe he knew better. Maybe he didn't know how. Either way, the moment passed to someone else. The tractor's tires bit and walked down the slope as if stepping onto a staircase made of dirt. The chain drew the pickup after it, not violently, not timidly, simply because that was what was happening, and there was no reason left for anything else to happen instead. The truck's front wheels kissed the water and sent 2 small fans of creek spray outward. Then its weight eased into the bed and sank a hand's depth. Not much, exactly enough. Grandpa kept the line straight and brought the truck to the middle where the flow braided and unbraided itself around stones. He let the tractor idle there, steady as a heartbeat. Sunlight flickered on the water and ticked along the chrome like patient fingers counting. He dismounted from the tractor. The chain lay taut. He waded forward, boots darkening as they met the creek. The water slid around his ankles, cool and sure. He took the hook in his hand and leaned into the pickup's rear corner to lift slack where he needed it. Mud sucked softly at his soles. He maneuvered the links with the same care he'd used to unbuckle a strap on a skittish colt. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. The man pushed his door open, stopping when he felt the edge of water press against the bottom seam. He stepped out into the creek with a small intake of breath, as if the cold had argued something he'd been saying to himself. His boots sank a fraction. He steadied at the cab and glared across the short distance that separated him from the older man. "You're making a mistake," he said. The statement landed with less authority than he intended. It didn't thud. It splashed. "Not today," Grandpa answered. He unlatched the final hitch point. The chain loosened and gave a sighing sound that only iron makes when it changes its mind. He gathered the links over his forearm, the weight of them familiar and right. "You think this is over?" the man said. His voice tried to climb and didn't quite clear the rung. "It's as over as you let it be," Grandpa said. He didn't add a lesson to the sentence. The lesson was all around them, son, on water, axle and mud. The stubborn fact of where a truck goes when it is parked, where it shouldn't be. He carried the chain through the creek, lifted it so it wouldn't snag on the stones, and laid it in a clean loop across the tractor's fender. He climbed up, set the tractor in gear, and drove out of the creek with the same calm he'd driven into it. Water dripped from the links, drawing dark circles in the dust that would turn pale again. As they dried, the tractor climbed the small bank and returned to the yard by the path that had been prepared for this before dawn, on a day even the birds seemed to understand. Behind him, the man stood beside his truck, pant legs wet to the shin. The badge on his vest no longer looked like authority. It looked like a decoration that didn't know where to belong. He looked up the slope toward the porch, where the family had remained, not triumphant, simply present. No one jeered. No one applauded. The ranch was not an audience. It was a witness. Grandpa parked the tractor near the shed and shut off the engine. The sudden quiet didn't feel empty. It felt concluded. He took the chain in both hands, felt the drag of water leaving it, and walked it back to its line of pegs. The shed smelled of oil and cut wood and the good fatigue of solved problems. He hung the chain where it lived and pressed it gently with 2 fingers to settle a last swinging link. When he stepped back into the light, Daniel met him halfway. "You want me to call anyone?" Daniel asked. "No," Grandpa said. "We've called who we need to." Sarah stood with her arms folded, not against her chest, but as if holding something steady around her. "He'll go," she said, half asking. "He will," Grandpa said. "Not because I told him to, because the creek did." Grandma's towel was folded now, neat and square. She didn't remember folding it. She reached out and straightened the collar of Grandpa's shirt, the way she had done for decades without thinking. "Breakfast is still warm," she said. Henry let go of the door frame and trotted down the steps to walk beside his grandfather. He looked up, searching the older man's face for something he could name. "Was that a fight?" Henry asked. "No," Grandpa said. "That was putting a thing back where it couldn't bother anyone." The boy considered this, nodded, and accepted it. Children have a talent for recognizing balanced answers. Down at the creek, the truck settled inch by inch as the mud made room for it, and then decided it had accommodated enough. The reflection of the cab rippled and broke with each small current, mending and breaking again. A dragonfly arrowed past and paused on a reed. The world resumed its habits. Word would travel. That was how towns worked, how roads and diner counters and post office lines made a net of stories that caught what mattered and let the rest drift. But the telling would not be the important part. What mattered had already happened. A line had been drawn in a way a person could feel underfoot. The day went forward. Hay moved. Hooves thudded. Hammer and nail met and parted with the brief, bright sounds of things improving. The quiet that followed the morning did not feel weary anymore. It felt earned. Around noon, Grandpa walked the path to the creek alone. He did not go to check on the man. He wasn't there. He had started down the road the minute the tractor turned away. Grandpa went to look at the water. He stood with his hands in his pockets and listened. The creek said what creeks always say, not much, and everything. He studied the truck the way he'd study a stump left after a tree had fallen part of the landscape now. Consequential only as a reminder. The tires wore a necklace of grass and mud. The bumper held a smear of reddish clay that would dry and flake. The windows returned to sky without judgment. Grandpa nodded once to the scene, not approving it, not gloating, just acknowledging that it had been done correctly. He turned and walked back up the path, leaving behind nothing but the simple record of boots, and even those would fade. When he reached the yard, Henry ran to meet him. "What now?" the boy asked. "Because children believe life arranges itself in chapters, if you ask in a clear enough voice." "Now we finish the work," Grandpa said. "We always finish the work." He lifted a bale with Daniel. He checked a cinch on Sarah's mare. He held a door for Grandma. The day moved through its tasks in the same order it always had, restored by the very act of being ordinary again. In the late afternoon, a county truck rolled slow past the lane and paused. The driver looked toward the house, tipped 2 fingers off the brim of his hat when he saw Grandpa, and then looked toward the creek with a small glance that held a lot of understanding. He didn't turn down the drive. He didn't need to. The county didn't have a form for this. Evening came with long shadows. The oaks spread them like blankets. The swing creaked once as air cooled. The barn door threw a square of darkness across the yard that made the dust dance in patterns for anyone with time to notice. The family ate with the kind of appetite that follows finished labor. No one mentioned the truck. They didn't avoid the subject. It simply had nothing more to give them. It had taught what it could teach. The rest belonged to the man who had brought it there and to the creek that now held it with impartial hands. Before bed, Grandpa stood on the porch and looked out at the last light lodging itself along the horizon. He thought about how problems insist on becoming part of a place if you let them, and how places insist on becoming themselves again if you help them. He thought about tools and patience and lines you draw only once, if you draw them straight. He went inside. The screen door tapped once and settled. Down by the water, the frogs began their evening chorus. The sound rose and fell, steady as breath. The creek, having done its work without ceremony, kept moving. It would be there tomorrow, and the day after, making its small, continuous changes to the stones that trusted it. On the ranch, the dragging had ended, but the lesson it carried did not. It unrolled in quiet ways, in the confidence of a gate left open because no one would block it anymore, in the calm of horses that no longer shied at a sudden engine idle, in the way a boy looked at a man and learned what strength looks like when it doesn't need to shout. The morning had begun with a truck trying to be a wall. It ended with a creek being a creek, a tractor being a tractor, and a grandfather being exactly who he had always been. The creek kept the truck like it had been waiting for it all along. Each day after, the sun glinted off its roof in patches. The water lapped against its tires, and the mud held it with a patient grip. It became less of an intrusion and more of a landmark and object lesson set down in water and stone. The man hadn't returned the first day. He had stomped out of the creek, soaking wet and sputtering threats that nobody believed. He had trudged down the road, shoulders stiff, head lowered. The second day, no sign of him. By the end of the week, the silence itself was an answer. He had been weighed, and he had chosen not to be weighed again. The creek kept the truck like it had been waiting for it all along. Each day after, the sun glinted off its roof in patches. The water lapped against its tires, and the mud held it with a patient grip. It became less of an intrusion and more of a landmark and object lesson set down in water and stone. The man hadn't returned the first day. He had stomped out of the creek, soaking wet and sputtering threats that nobody believed. He had trudged down the road, shoulders stiff, head lowered. The second day, no sign of him. By the end of the week, the silence itself was an answer. He had been weighed, and he had chosen not to be weighed again. Paragraph 2, Image 2, Sheriff's visit. But the absence didn't erase the tension overnight. The family carried it like a shadow in their movements. Sarah still caught herself glancing toward the driveway whenever she heard an engine, heart quickening until she saw it was just a neighbor passing on the county road. Daniel worked with a sharper edge, swinging the hammer harder than necessary, driving nails deeper. Even Grandma, who had insisted on kindness first, found herself muttering under her breath about fools who wore badges that didn't belong to them. Only Grandpa seemed unchanged. He rose with the sun, drank his tea on the porch, and tended the ranch as though nothing had ever been different. If he noticed the way the family's nerves still twitched, he didn't mention it. He simply kept on, steady as the tractor, steady as the creek. Word spread quickly, of course. In town, the story grew with every telling. At the diner, men laughed into their coffee as they told it, each one adding his own flourish. How the truck had been dragged half a mile. How the man had leaped out and begged before the water swallowed his ride. How Grandpa hadn't spoken a single word through the whole ordeal. At the hardware store, people nudged each other and said, "That's the rancher who doesn't bother with paperwork. He lets the land do his talking." Grandpa never went to town to correct them. He didn't need to. The ranch had its truth, and the town had its tale, and both served their purpose. One afternoon, Sheriff Johnson himself drove up the lane, the dust from his cruiser rising like a flag behind him. He stepped out slow, hat in hand, and nodded toward the porch where Grandpa sat. "Afternoon?" the sheriff said. "Afternoon," Grandpa returned. The sheriff hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Heard you had some trouble out this way." Grandpa sipped his tea. "Not anymore." The sheriff chuckled softly, looking toward the direction of the creek. "Truck's still down there, where it belongs," Grandpa said. The sheriff nodded. "Well, we've had a few complaints about a man claiming to be HOA security. Seems he's been poking around places all over the county. Figured he'd trip up somewhere." He glanced back at Grandpa, eyes twinkling just a bit. "Didn't figure it'd be a creek that caught him." Grandpa gave the smallest shrug. "Creek was there. He was there, they worked it out." The sheriff laughed outright at that, then sobered. "No charges needed from my end. Long as you don't mind a muddy landmark for a while. County towel fish it out when they're good and ready." Meanwhile, he tipped his hat. "You did what needed doing." Grandpa didn't answer, but his silence carried the weight of agreement. When the sheriff left, Daniel shook his head. In amazement, "They're just letting it sit there." Grandpa set his cup down. "Sometimes the best place for a thing is where it landed. Let folks see it. Let 'em remember." And remember, they did. The truck in the creek became a quiet lesson for anyone who heard the story. Children from neighboring farms whispered about it on their way to school. Ranch hands laughed about it when they passed through the feed store. Even strangers who'd never set foot on the property nodded knowingly when someone mentioned the rancher and his chain. But for the family, the lesson was closer, sharper, more personal. It was in the way Henry now looked at his grandfather, eyes wide with something more than admiration. It was understanding. He had seen that strength wasn't always about shouting, or fists, or even arguments. It was about knowing when to act, and acting without hesitation. It was in the way Sarah carried herself, straighter and surer, no longer second-guessing her voice when she spoke to someone who tried to brush her aside. It was in the way Daniel worked with a deeper pride, realizing that a ranch wasn't defended by fences or paperwork alone, but by the will of the people who lived on it. And it was in Grandma's quiet smile each evening, when she set dinner on the table and looked around at her family, safe and together. She had tried kindness, and she would never regret it, but she also understood now, as clearly as Grandpa always had, that some people only respected boundaries drawn in iron and chain. The creek went on speaking in its soft voice, day after day, wearing at the stones and carrying the story downstream. Seasons would pass. Grass would grow around the truck's half-buried tires. The shine would fade, the badge would rust, and someday, maybe, no trace would remain. But the line had been drawn, and the family knew, deep down, that it wasn't just about a truck or a trespasser. It was about the promise of home, the kind of promise you kept, not only with words, but with the unshakable certainty of action. Grandpa never gave speeches about it. He never told the children to remember. He didn't need to. The lesson was written into the land itself. into the shape of the day when the tractor rolled, into the memory of the sound of iron links tightening and the sight of a truck being put exactly where it belonged. On the porch, when the evenings grew long and the stars filled the sky, Henry sometimes asked again, "Grandpa, why did you do it?" Grandpa would take his time before answering. He'd watch the horizon, sip his tea, and finally say, "Because home is worth standing for, and you only have to stand once if you stand right." The boy never forgot those words, neither did anyone else. The ranch carried on, steady and sure, its doors unblocked, its paths clear, its rhythm restored, and down by the creek, where the water slipped past the stones, the world kept a quiet record of the day. One man's arrogance met another man's resolve and lost.